Welcome to the discussion video on Module 5.1, the Nonprofit Organizations concept. So for this video, we will be studying the NPOs, the accounting for NPOs. We will discuss and illustrate some of the general accounting procedures and financial statement presentation of nonprofit organizations such as schools, colleges, and universities, hospitals, and voluntary health and welfare organizations. So let us proceed by defining first what non-profit organizations and not-for-profit organizations are. It is an entity that is operated for the benefit of the society as a whole rather than the benefit of an individual or shareholders. It strives only to obtain revenue sufficient to cover its expenses. So let us read more. The nonprofit organizations include civic organizations, college and universities, cultural institutions, hospitals, labor unions, private foundations, professional organizations, religious organizations, cooperatives, and social and country clubs. They do not include governmental units. So, as the word imply, nonprofit organization uh, are organizations that exist for uh, a specific advocacy, for a specific purpose, and not for profit. So we account for the revenues covering its expenses. And it must be clear na these non-profit organizations should not be government institutions. Kasi if it is government institutions, papasok yan dun sa government accounting. So, this is the reason why the government accounting has been separated to accounting for non-profit organizations. They may be serving the same purpose such as the public welfare, but the treatment in accounting is different in non-profit organizations and in governmental institutions. So for this module, we will be focusing our attention to schools, colleges and universities, hospitals, and voluntary health and welfare organizations. So yan ang focus natin. So let us first characterize the non-profit organizations by first illustrating the similarities between a government institution, a business enterprise, and a non-profit organization. So what are their similarities? One is yung public service because non-profit and government institutions are both have the advocacy of bringing in public service in their operations. Sabi dito, the non-profit organizations usually render services to society as a whole. The members of the society may range from a limited number of citizens. The governmental entities, like governmental entities, the services of non-profit are for the benefit of many rather than the few. Next, the no-profit motives. This is the same with the government institutions. Therefore, the nonprofit organizations are exempt from income taxes but not from business taxes. So, we will not be dealing more on the taxation side because it will be covered on your taxation subjects. But several legislations have changed the concept of exempting the nonprofit organizations to taxes. So nabago yung treatment on this, especially with the passage of the train law. So we are just illustrating that the nonprofit organizations are of no profit motives, and some of the items ng nonprofit organizations are not taxable. So yun lang muna ang coverage under the concept of nonprofit organizations, because we will be focusing on the presentation of the financial statements, how they recognize transactions, anong mga account titles ang ginagamit, anong mga funds ang ginagamit, rather than dealing on the taxation side of the accounting for nonprofit organizations. Next, it is financed by the citizenry. As much as the government is funded by the taxes paid by its citizens, the nonprofit organizations is more of the funds of the nonprofit organizations comes from voluntary contributions and donations from several individuals. Next, the stewardship of resources. The stewardship of resources means that since the government is using the funds of coming from the taxes paid by by its citizen, uh, the non-profit organizations serves as a steward o sila yung nangangalaga doon sa mga resources of of individuals donating from them for them. Next, the concept of fund accounting. It means that the internal accounting for these organizations is the fund, which is an accounting entity which has a self-balancing set of accounts in recording cash and other financial resources, together with related liabilities and changes thereof, subject to limitations and restrictions. So under the government accounting, we use fund accounting, and under non-profit organizations, we also use the concept of fund accounting. Accrual accounting, the system of accounting to be used in accounting for non-profit organizations. So, accrual accounting din ang gagamitin under the non-profit organization. However, in government accounting, ginagamit natin yung um, uh, ginagamit din natin yung modified accrual basis. The statement of financial position, these are the financial statements which are prepared under the nonprofit organization. They are essentially the same in terms of the statement of financial position, the statement of cash flows, the notes to financial statements. Ang medyo na iba lang is the terminology used under the statement of activities. This statement reports the revenue, gains, and expenses and losses of a non-profit organization. This is the equivalent of the income statement. So, a statement of activities rather than saying statement of financial performance, because nonprofit organization you are not inclined into looking at how your profit has been generated for a particular period, but on how the activities has been commenced and has been consummated. Kung paanong na-conduct, paano na-finance itong mga activities. Yun yung naka-identify under the statement of activities. So under the non-profit organization, you will be encountering the terms such as the unrestricted fund, the temporarily restricted fund, and the permanently restricted fund. So as the term imply, when we say unrestricted fund, it includes the assets of a non-profit organization that are available for use as authorized by the board of directors, and this is not restricted for specific purpose. While kapag restricted fund, it is separated into two. Kapag restricted fund, merong restriction yan, of course, as the term implies. But how can you classify whether it is temporarily restricted and permanently restricted? So this will guide us. These are unexpended resources that are to be used for a particular purpose. It could either be donor restricted if the donor stipulated a specific use of donation, or time restricted if a fund will not be used for a certain period of time. So let us compare. Pag permanently restricted naman, this fund must be maintained or used in a certain way of resources which must be invested permanently with income to be used for either restricted or unrestricted purposes. Okay, the guiding rule for you to identify whether it is temporarily restricted and it is permanently restricted is the period. When we say permanently restricted, normally the restriction is indefinite. So, hindi mo ma-identify kung hanggang kailan tatagal yung restriction. So, normally, you classify it as permanently restricted. While yung temporarily restricted ay makikita mo kaagad. One is it is donor restricted. So kapag na-comply itong stipulation o yung specific restriction dun sa donation na ibinigay, ay mawawala yung restriction at mapupunta na siya sa unrestricted fund. So, ganun ang concept ng temporarily restricted. While the time restricted, if a fund will not be used for a certain period, hindi mo pa siya pwedeng gamitin for 1 year from the date of ganito. For example, 3 months from the date of donation, that is time restricted. But when the time lapsed, the temporarily restricted fund will be transferred to the unrestricted fund. However, kapag permanent restricted ang pinag-usapan natin, hindi mo siya ma-identify. The fund's restriction is indefinite. And in some cases, merong tinatawag na endowment fund kung saan doon mo na ilalagay yung fund na yon. Later we will discuss what endowment fund is. But the concept is under the permanently restricted fund, the funds are indefinitely restricted at hindi mo ma-identify kung hanggang kailan siya uh, yung restriction na ibinigay sa kanya nung donor. So let us look at the funds used under the non-profit organizations, the general or unrestricted fund or current unrestricted fund. This fund is used for the primary operations of a non-profit organization. The endowment fund is, ito yung tinutukoy ko kanina, the endowment fund is a fund established by a charitable organization as to ensure an ongoing source of support for their programs and operations. So may fund na kinreate for a specific purpose. So let us look at how endowment fund is used. So there are three types of endowment fund: the regular or permanent endowment fund, the term endowment fund, and the quasi endowment. So let us look. Under the regular or the permanent endowment, the principal must be maintained indefinitely in revenue-producing investments. It is permanently restricted, but the revenue from the fund can either be temporarily or restricted or unrestricted. So under the regular or permanent endowment fund, may yung principal donation, dahil yan ay nasa isang fund, yung donation ay nag-i-incur, nag-earn siya ng interest or pwedeng revenues. So yung revenues nun can be either temporarily restricted or unrestricted. But the principal is permanently restricted muna, indefinitely. So hindi mo pwedeng galawin yung yung principal under the permanent endowment fund. However, under the term endowment fund, the principal may be expended after the passage of a certain period or the occurrence of an event specified by the donor. So this is a temporarily restricted fund. So kapag term endowment, it is temporarily restricted. Under the last, yung quasi-endowment, which is established by the governing board of the non-profit organization, it is unrestricted. So some funds includes agency fund, loan fund, plant fund, annuity fund, and life fund. Meron naman naka-define dyan kung anong mga kung saan ginagamit itong mga funds na ito. Please take a look at how it is used. So let us just take a look at how the funds are under hospitals. The funds kept are general or unrestricted, restricted fund. So under the restricted fund, we have the temporarily restricted fund specific purpose, which is the same with the donor imposed restriction, the endowment fund, the plant replacement expansion fund, and the permanently restricted fund as under restricted fund. So under the hospitals, let us familiarize with the classifications of revenue. We use the patient service revenue. Anong classification nitong account title na ito? This includes room and board, nursing services, and other professional services. It is recorded at gross amount but reported at net of amounts that are deductions from revenues. Charity care services provided free of charge are excluded from both gross and net patient service revenues. Contractual adjustments and courtesy allowances are also deducted from gross patient service revenue. So, anong sinasabi dito? And This includes yung mga room fees, boarding, nursing, and professional fees na binabayad. Lahat yon ay classified as a patient service revenue when it is earned. So, ang sabi dito, it is recorded at gross amount. So, when it is recorded at gross amount, kung magkano yung total gross revenues nitong patient service. However, when it is reported under the financial statements, it is recorded at the net amounts, which incorporates the deductions from the revenues. So let us take a look at the charity care services. So under the charity care services, so merong mga some deductions to the patient service revenue. Diyan, na later on we will encounter under the illustrations on module 5.2. So merong mga contractual adjustments. Normally these are the contract between the hospitals and PhilHealth, of the hospitals and Medicare. So since normally third party ang nagbabayad under the non-profit organizations, dahil especially in the Philippines, the PhilHealth has a wider coverage on the hospitalization of the citizens of the Filipinos. So more or less ay mas majority of the transactions are paid by the Philippine Health, yung Philippine Health Insurance Corporation. So next is yung mga premium fees. Revenues from agreements with the hospital provides any necessary patient services for a specific fee. These are recorded separately from patient service revenues and collected whether services are actually rendered or not. So kung aside from yung mga patient service revenue, ay sometimes the hospital can maybe charge specific fees on other patient services na out of na doon sa sinabing kanina yung mga room and board, nursing services, and other professional revenues. It is charged to premium fees. The other operating revenue, other than the patient service and other than the premium fees, this includes services to patients other than that for healthcare and revenues from sales and services provided to non-patients. So ano yan? Anong mga classification yan? Pwedeng, halimbawa yung hospital ay meron siyang cafeteria, mga canteen, o mga rental stalls dun sa paligid ng hospitals. This is recorded under the other operating revenue account title. So we have the contra revenue accounts, yung courtesy discounts allowed to doctors and employees. Then contractual discounts arranged with third persons. Examples, PhilHealth will frequently have agreements to reimburse at less than established rates. So merong mga contra revenue accounts. So kapag contra revenue accounts, these are debited. So classification of expenses, yung normal, yung operating expenses, these are reported on an accrual and normally include functional categories ranging from principal to admin. So expenses are also classified as the following and are reported on the functional basis. So you classify it whether it is program services or it is supporting activities. So kapag program, it relates to organizations, social activities. Kapag supporting naman, it is more of admin and fundraising costs. Okay, let us take a look at the university's funds kept. The revenues includes tuition fees, government appropriations, government grants, private gifts, endowment income, sales and services of educational activities, sales and services of auxiliary services, include educational and general expenditures, auxiliary services, and independent operations. Let me just clarify, sir, bakit mayroong mga government appropriations, government grants, private gifts, endowment income, sales and services of educational activities, sales and services of auxiliary services. So, ang tinutukoy lang natin dito is if the government has allotted a particular budget for a ang pinag-uusapan natin dito is mga non-profit private organizations, private universities, ha? Uh, not state universities and colleges because state universities or colleges are covered by government accounting. Voluntary health and welfare organizations. Okay, balikan natin. Under the universities, may sinasabi siyang see letters A to G of funds generally kept by a non-profit organization because essentially the same ito. So, balikan natin. Asan ba yung A to G? Ito, yung diniscuss natin kanina. Yung general unrestricted fund up to the life fund because essentially yun din ang kinikep ng universities. Okay, let's look at the voluntary health and welfare organizations. So they use current unrestricted, current restricted, custodial fund, which is same as the agency fund, the land building and equipment fund. The revenues are to be recorded at accrual basis. So it can be either under public support or under revenues from supporting activities. Inflow of services from voluntary donors who receive no direct personal benefit from the organization's program in exchange of their contributions. Inflows of resources from organizations' financial activities. So, kapag mga donations, it flows to under the public support classification. While when it is incurred when it is earned out of the revenues on the financial activities of the organization itself, it is classified under revenues from supporting activities on its own operations. So let us classify expenses. Donation of services, donation of facilities, pledges. So under module 5.2, we will be discussing more of how to recognize it under a practical application. So when it is a donation of services, the recognition is under the fair value less any cost directly attributable to the service. So you debit salaries expense and then you credit contribution revenue. When it is a facility, you debit building or building when it is a building, or inventory when it is an inventory, and then credit contribution revenue. When it is a pledge, this is recorded at gross amount, you debit pledge receivable and then you credit contribution revenue. When you collect the pledges, um, you debit cash and then you credit pledges receivable. So, ano ba tong pledges na tinutukoy na to? Uh, these are donations which are not yet realized. Kumbaga, pinangako pa lang, pinledge pa lang na ibibigay yung ganitong item or ibibigay yung ganitong amount of cash at a particular period. So you recognize it as a pledge receivable and then you credit contribution revenue so as to monitor and for transparency. Kasi kung hindi mo yan i-record as a receivable, there is a possibility that it will not be, when it is collected, it will not be accounted for. Kaya ina-account mo na siya when it is pledge. Okay, asset restriction and reclassification. When you just declassify, for example, a temporarily restricted fund into a restricted fund, you just have to debit kung saan nanggaling yung fund and then you have to credit kung saan naman pumunta yung fund. And vice versa. Okay, I think these last items are for your reading, yung mga other notes. Because more or less, much of this has already been discussed. So I think that ends the discussion on Module 5.1 for the concepts on the accounting for nonprofit organizations. For the next module, we'll be discussing the practical applications, the recording of the journal entries under nonprofit organizations, and more of analysis on how the accounting for NPO works. Okay, thank you.